Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Half-Deva. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. Many thanks for being my grindstone, Bai Xiaochun. I've finally achieved my cultivation base breakthrough and am a half-deva. I've been stuck in place for far too long now and have you to thank. Therefore, in recompense, I will simply cripple your cultivation base and won't kill you. Gongsun Yi looked both excited and proud. Throwing his head back, he laughed maniacally. As he had said, he had been waiting for this day for a very, very long time. The pressure he had felt from Bai Xiaochun during their fight had been incredible. Upon seeing the undying Emperor's fist in action the first time, he had been aware that he couldn't defeat it. But he was proud and confident, and thus couldn't accept that. Furthermore, there had also been the possibility that he could take the situation and use it to achieve a breakthrough. It was in that moment that he decided to use Bai Xiaochun as his grindstone, to use the pressure to not only ramp up his battle spirit to the ultimate degree, but to achieve a breakthrough during that critical moment between life and death. The first possibility was that he would step halfway into the Deva realm, and wait until a later date to acquire a magical item with a 15-fold spirit enhancement or higher, which he could then use to gain enlightenment of heaven and earth and become a true Deva. The second possibility was that he would fail, and lose the fight. However, even if he ended up losing, he was confident that Bai Xiaochun wouldn't kill him. Although such a loss would be a bitter pill to swallow, it was a cost he could afford to pay. And right now, he was laughing maniacally as he performed a double-handed incantation gesture. Instantly, rumbling sounds could be heard around him as 200,000 golden magical symbols appeared, transforming into a massive vortex that moved forward to meet the undying Emperor's fist. Bai Xiaochun's eyes were nearly popping out of his skull. Never could he have imagined that Gongsun Yi would actually achieve a breakthrough right here and now. Well, that way of doing things really worked out for him, he thought, taking a deep breath, and also feeling a bit envious. When he thought about how he had suffered untold hardships to reach the mid-nascent soul stage, it was really grating that his opponent had used a moment of life or death crisis to break through and become a half-deva. That fact in and of itself left Bai Xiaochun feeling a bit irritated, but then Gongsun Yi went so far as to laugh maniacally, and that got him really mad. "You thankless wretch," he shouted. "Just like the giant ghost king. I was the one who helped you make your breakthrough, and now you say you're gonna cripple my cultivation base. Really the type who bites the hand that feeds you, huh?" Bai Xiaochun was of the mind that it wouldn't be good to let Gongsun Yi continue to show off. He needed to teach him a good lesson, and make sure he understood the old saying, if you receive a water drop of kindness, repay it with a flowing spring. Who cares if you made a breakthrough? Lord Bai is going to kidnap you anyway. Eyes bloodshot, he loosened his hand briefly, shook it out, and then clenched it down into another fist. He wasn't unleashing a second undying Emperor's fist, instead, he was taking some of the power he had held back before and adding it into the current fist strike. Before, he had used only 50% of what was at his disposal. But now, he added in an extra 30%. The black vortex of the undying Emperor's fist began to emit a shocking black glow, and also began to grow larger than before as it rumbled toward Gongsun Yi in incredibly domineering fashion. "Who said you could act so aggressive?" he shouted. "Time to cut you down to size." Bai Xiaochun's thunderous voice caused Gongsun Yi's previous excited expression to freeze. Then, his face was overtaken by an expression of utter disbelief. When his golden vortex made contact with the black hole, all 200,000 golden magical symbols shattered. Then, in the blink of an eye, the enormous fist-like black hole was right in front of Gongsun Yi. "Impossible. I'm a half-deva. I can't lose." Gongsun Yi snarled as he performed a double-handed incantation gesture, rotating his cultivation base to defend himself. "Half-deva? Huh. Lord Bai has already defeated 4 real devas. Who do you think you are? Back down, you hear me? Back down. Your ass is mine, you ingrate." Howling, he shot forward, propelling the black hole forward with explosive might. As he did, the divine glow of the 5 elements could be seen within his heaven-down nascent soul. Booming rumbles filled the air. The entire necromancer kettle seemed to fill with ear-splitting, deafening booms. Cascades of blood shot out of Gongsun Yi's mouth as he was sent tumbling backward like a kite with its string cut. His chest was a mass of gore, and all his limbs were bent at odd angles. Even his nascent soul seemed in poor condition. However, what had been struck most deeply was his pride. How is this possible? He had gone from wild elation because of his breakthrough to being grievously injured. In his confusion, his vision began to fade as he started to lose consciousness. And yet, before he could even stop moving, Bai Xiaochun shot to his side, lifted his right hand, and slapped him viciously. Whack! Gongsun Yi was sealed and then tossed into Bai Xiaochun's bag of holding. Huffing and puffing, Bai Xiaochun landed onto a hilltop in the basin, where he sat down cross-legged, his face pale. Using 80% of the power of the undying emperor's fist had taken his fleshly body power down to the very minimum. He was also filled with prickles of stinging pain. Thankfully, although his fleshly body had been weakened, his heaven-Dao nascent soul cultivation base was still fine, and was in fact the reason he had dared to unleash the power he had. You bunch of bullies. Well, when Lord Bai gets angry, he frightens even himself. Do you really think the undying body I've worked so hard on, and my heaven-Dao nascent soul, are so weak? Grumbling to himself, he thought back to everything that had occurred so far in the necromancer kettle, and the sheer unbelievable nature of it all left him admiring himself. I really have gotten pretty brave lately, he murmured. First there was the adventure in the Bai clan. Then he had kidnapped the clan chief, which was what had really gotten him addicted. Afterward, he went so far as to kidnap the giant ghost king, and now here he had gone and kidnapped virtually all of the so-called chosen of the wildlands. Once word of this got out, he would definitely become even more famous throughout the wildlands. It's all the fault of that bastard the giant ghost king, he thought, feeling very annoyed. Then he looked over at the Ghost King orchid, protected by the white shield of the restrictive spell. By now, it was getting very close to the time when the flower would fully bloom. It was also possible to see a fruit growing in the middle of the flower, rapidly reaching the point of being ripe. Bai Xiaochun looked at the flower and grumbled to himself morosely for a bit, thinking about his plan to get revenge on the giant Ghost King. Then he snorted coldly and pulled the second prince, Gongsun Yi, and all the other recently captured chosen out of his bag of holding. They were nearly unconscious, but were still capable of groggily looking over at Bai Xiaochun. Immediately, their faces went pale, and their eyes shone with terror. As for the second prince, he seemed like he wanted to say something, but before he could, Bai Xiaochun glared and brandished the eternal parasol. Don't even think about talking to me. I have germophobia. Bai Hao, listen to me. Before he could say anything else, the second prince's face fell. Shivering, he let out a miserable scream as his life force was drained by the eternal parasol, turning him into skin and bones. Then Bai Xiaochun went on to the rest of the chosen, all of whom screamed and cursed him as the eternal parasol extracted their life force. How dare you, Bai Hao? My father won't let you get away with this. You'll never escape with your life after this, Bai Hao. However, the more lividly people cursed, the more life force Bai Xiaochun would take away. Soon the others realized this, and the clever ones among them would simply look at him quietly. Feeling bad, Bai Xiaochun would take a bit less life force from them. In the end, he got to Gongsun Yi, who looked up at Bai Xiaochun with mixed emotions in his eyes. However, his desire to do battle could still be seen in his eyes. Bai Xiaochun actually felt some respect for Gongsun Yi, and was going back and forth about whether to take his life force. Next time we meet, are you going to attack me again? He asked. Eyes brimming with battle spirit, and murderous aura surging, Gongsun Yi said, of course I will. We'll meet again one day, and then I'll personally crush you beneath my feet. Well fudge, Bai Xiaochun shot back. Can't you say anything that sounds nice? What's with all the fighting and killing all the time? Glaring, he shoved the eternal parasol into his chest. After harvesting the life force from everyone, he put his battle trophies back into his bag of holding, then sat down cross-legged and sent some divine sense out to form a defensive barrier. Then he began to cultivate his undying bones. 6 hours later, cracking sounds could be heard from inside of him. His eyes opened, and they shone with golden light. At the same time, warmth filled him. His fleshly body power was not fully recovered, and yet, his defensive capabilities had increased another notch. 7th stratum of the tempered bones, he murmured excitedly. Just when he was about to test out his newfound power, his expression flickered, and he looked over to the Ghost King orchid in the restrictive spell. From the black glow rising up from the flower, it was clear that it was about to bloom. There were numerous mountain ranges and rivers in the necromancer kettle, and all of them eventually led to the basin that was home to the Ghost King orchid. As of this moment, it was fully in bloom, its petals gracefully curved, and a fragrant aroma wafting off of it. It was a fragrance that actually caused the shadowy evening light to grow even darker. In the blink of an eye, the entire sky turned black. At the same time, a strong aura of death spilled out from the flower, spreading out to fill the entire world of the necromancer kettle. Within the mists, the vengeful souls and evil ghosts trembled, and then began to kowtow in the direction of the Ghost King orchid. Respectful, even reverent expressions could be seen on their faces, as though they were prostrating to some sort of king. As the flower fully bloomed, the previously greenish fruit in the middle of the flower began to turn black. It was even possible to see the face of a ghost on it. Bai Xiaochun recognized that face. It looked exactly like the face on the giant ghost statue in the middle of Giant Ghost City. Clearly, the reason why this fruit was so crucial to the giant ghost king was that it was somehow connected to the special technique he cultivated, although Bai Xiaochun had no way to know the specific details. Even as he watched, the petals of the Ghost King orchid began to fall off and transform into mist, one by one. As they did, the fruit on the Ghost King orchid turned more and more black. At the same time, a shocking gravitational force sprang up from the white restrictive spell. As it did, the fruit began to rise up toward the vortex created by the spell. In that instant, it was as if the white restrictive spell knew it had completed its mission, and transformed into countless motes of light that, instead of returning to Bai Xiaochun, dissipated into the surroundings. To see that happen so suddenly provoked a long sigh from Bai Xiaochun. Depressed, he realized that the giant ghost king's plan had worked exactly as intended, with the only downside being that Bai Xiaochun had been sacrificed in the process. Things aren't over yet. Although he had come out completely victorious in all of his battles with the Chosen, he was still left with lingering fear about the whole situation. It was actually infuriating that the giant ghost king hadn't just directly explained what was going on. It's obvious that he doesn't trust me. He was worried that if he told the truth, I would refuse to come. HMPH, am I really that kind of person? Does he think I'd really be scared of something as non-dangerous as this place? What kind of a person does he think I am? Having reached this point in his train of thought, Bai Xiaochun immediately began to feel a twinge of guilt. Therefore, he dispelled all inner questions about whether or not he really would have come if he'd known the truth. Turning, he headed toward the mouth of the necromancer kettle. Around that time, the entire world of the necromancer kettle trembled, and the area near the mouth slowly began to open. There are still a dozen or so people who escaped. They're probably out there hiding somewhere, and there's still about 2 hours left. Whatever. Since they fled, I'll let them off the hook this time. It was only at this point that Bai Xiaochun started to get nervous. Looking down at his bag of holding, he realized that he really had done something monumental here. His bag of holding was now a scalding hot potato, and he had no desire whatsoever to hold onto it for any longer than necessary. He needed to get back as soon as possible to hand it over to the giant ghost king. With that, he picked up speed as he headed toward the mouth of the necromancer kettle. However, even as he neared the exit, he saw another beam of light shoot toward it from a different direction, and reach it before him. It was none other than Princess Xu Shan from Spirit Advent City. Within moments, she was hovering in front of the enormous vortex that was the exit of the necromancer kettle. By stepping through that vortex, one could leave the kettle. However, Xu Shan didn't step into the exit. Instead, she stood there as if to bar the way. When she turned to look at Bai Xiaochun, his heart sank as he saw the glittering light of her jade pendant rising to surround her. How are you gonna try to get away this time, Bai Hao? Xu Shan said, sounding very proud of herself. Bai Xiaochun was scowling on the verge of tears. The sight of Xu Shan immediately caused him to feel a headache coming on. Earlier, he had thought that Chen Manyao would be the biggest thorn in his side, and had completely forgotten about the annoying Xu Shan. Even if he tried to fight her, it would do no good. There she stood in front of the exit, clearly having no intention of moving. Obviously, he was going to have to pay the price to get past her. Just what exactly do you want, huh? Bai Xiaochun said. What do I want? She said angrily, glaring at him. I want to know why you ran away every time you saw me. Bai Xiaochun sighed. Deciding it would be better to save his breath and just tell the truth, he said, with that jade pendant your father gave you, there's no way I can beat you. It would be a waste of time fighting, so I just ran. Waste of time? She shot back. Then, eyes flashing, she asked, HMPH. Well, why did you go and kidnap everyone? Looking as though he felt very wronged, he explained, those were the giant ghost king's orders. A nobody like me couldn't defy the dharmic decree of the giant ghost king, could he? Really? She asked suspiciously. Absolutely. Positively. It's true from many points of view. After swearing up and down, he hesitated for a moment and then added, hey, why don't we skip the fight this time? Just let me out of here, okay. Xu Shan didn't respond at first, and simply looked at him, trying to decide if what he said was true or not. Normally speaking, she wouldn't be so easily convinced. And yet, for some reason, she just felt like trusting him. Suddenly, she smacked her bag of holding, causing more than a dozen soul cultivators to spill out into the open. They were all chosen from the various important clans, and all of them had clearly been beaten badly in fights. Their cultivation bases were sealed, and as soon as they began to pile up outside of her bag of holding, they began to curse in their hearts, and yet didn't dare to give voice to any of that. Instead, they looked fearfully at Xu Shan, and then over at Bai Xiaochun. As for Bai Xiaochun, his jaw dropped. These were all of the people who had previously given up, the ones he had assumed had fled to hide wherever they could find places to hole up. Never could he have imagined that they would all have been captured by the fiendish devilish Xu Shan. He said, staring a bit blankly at Xu Shan, and wondering why the termagant would possibly be doing something like this. Since you're acting under the orders of the giant ghost king, then take these ones with you. When she spoke, her gaze didn't seem as sharp as before, and she wasn't speaking so loudly. In fact, there was something very strange about the look in her eyes. Bai Xiaochun was even more taken aback. However, based on the strange look in her eyes, he suddenly came to an outrageous conclusion, something that he initially almost couldn't believe was true. Aha, I get it, he thought. She's one of the people the giant ghost king said would help me. Eyes sparkling, he blurted out that very thought, you work for the giant ghost king too. And yet, for some unknown reason, Xu Shan seemed to suddenly get very irritated. Stomping her foot, she suddenly launched herself into the air toward Bai Xiaochun, clenching both hands into fists as she prepared to attack. One slip of the tongue and she wants to fight? This Xu Shan is crazy. Smiling bitterly inside, he took a breath, stepped forward, and shouted, if you've got what it takes, then fight without that jade pendant. Clenching his hand into a fist, he unleashed a fist strike. Fine, I won't use it, Xu Shan said crossly. The light of the pendant winked out as she continued to barrel toward Bai Xiaochun. A boom rang out, and ripples spread out in all directions. Xu Shan had an incredibly tough fleshly body, but after being struck by Bai Xiaochun, blood sprayed out of her mouth, and cracking sounds rang out as she suffered a grievous injury. And yet, that strange look in her eye only grew stronger, and she spun to attack him again. This Xu Shan has a screw loose, but she's definitely hot. She's trying to use that look in her eye to mess with my emotions. Hesitant and on guard, he unleashed another attack, causing Xu Shan to tumble backward, blood spraying out of her mouth. Considering the fact that she really wasn't using that jade pendant of hers, Bai Xiaochun was more convinced than ever that there was something wrong with her mentally. With that, he lunged forward, and instead of striking her with a fist, used a palm, hitting her in the back and sealing her instantly. The smoothness of it all actually seemed strange to Bai Xiaochun. Grabbing her, and heart-pounding, he contemplated how he had really hooked a big fish this time. With her life force, I can reach the 8th stratum of the tempered bones. Having reached this point in his train of thought, he took out his eternal parasol and prepared to stab it into her. However, it was at that point that Xu Shan completely ignored the parasol and, her eyes shining with that strange light, loudly said, I love you, Bai Hao. Huh? Startled, Bai Xiaochun dropped Xu Shan onto the ground with a thump. Xu Shan's words struck Bai Xiaochun's ears like a thunderbolt, nearly striking him senseless. Although he had had his suspicions about the strange look in her eyes, it had seemed so improbable that she harbored romantic feelings that he had simply dismissed the notion. After all, they had only met a few days before, and had been enemies the entire time. Bai Xiaochun really couldn't think of anything he had done to attract the interest of the termagant Xu Shan. Shocked, he couldn't help but take a moment to examine Xu Shan's face a bit more closely, and then his gaze slid down the rest of her body. The truth was that, despite her violent tendencies, she was actually very attractive. However, he quickly realized that he shouldn't be thinking that way. No, this Xu Shan has a screw loose, and is very violent. She's definitely not my type. I have my boo, and big sis Junwan, and Xiaomei. Plus, there are the hundreds of thousands of girls who like me back in the river-defying sect. I really am just too outstanding. No matter where I go, all of the girls chase me. What a headache. Sighing inwardly, but simultaneously savoring the moment, he suddenly felt more confident and proud than ever. That was especially true when he thought about the countless love letters he had received all those years ago, which proved how dashing he was, and that he was truly unparalleled under heaven. The dozen or so chosen nearby who had been sealed and immobilized were also staring in mute shock, their minds reeling with so much disbelief that they almost couldn't recover. Bai Xiaochun sighed and put his eternal parasol away. He was in no mood for stabbing people with it now. Sighing, he grabbed Xu Shan and put her into his bag of holding. Considering how the termagant was an admirer, though, he put her in a special, more private part of the bag of holding. The only other person in that special location was Chen Manyao. As for the other wildlander chosen, he also stashed them in his bag of holding. Having accomplished these things, he got his breathing under control and then looked at the exit vortex, heart pounding. After thinking for a moment to come up with a plan, he suddenly reached down and tore his robe up. However, that didn't seem like enough, so he then slapped himself in the face, and even sent some blood oozing out of his mouth. At that point, he stepped through the exit. Outside of the necromancer kettle, more than 100 people were quietly waiting. Whether it was the cloudy-eyed old man who had escorted Zhou Hong, or the old woman who was Shu Shan's Dao protector, all of them had calm expressions. Apparently, they had utmost confidence that there was nothing dangerous in the necromancer kettle that could harm the various heirs apparent, princesses, and princes. Therefore, few people had even thought much about Bai Xiaochun, nor even considered the possibility that he might accomplish anything in the necromancer kettle. Even the middle-aged man who had escorted the second prince seemed to have the same attitude. His expression was placid as he looked at the necromancer kettle and waited for everyone to emerge from inside. It was almost unnecessary to mention how the other chosen and Dao protectors were reacting. All of them seemed very relaxed, and many were even chatting and laughing with each other. Clearly, no one was worried about the situation. After all, considering that all three of the other heavenly kings were working together, there was no doubt in their mind that the giant ghost king would come out as the loser. In fact, there was literally no chance of him prevailing. As for Bai Hao, although most of them had heard some stories about him, they still discounted him immediately. In fact, many people had already assumed that he would perish. The only thing they were wondering was which of the other heavenly kings would end up with the ghost king fruit. A few of the people present were even making friendly wagers. Unless something unexpected happens, the junior champion king will surely acquire the flower. Not necessarily. Princess Shu Shan is not the type to casually admit defeat. If she gets stubborn, she could cause a real headache for him. Prince Zhou Hong is an ambitious and ruthless character. All of the other chosen of the generation have been completely won over by him. I'd say that Zhou Hong definitely has a better chance than the others. After all, it's not all just about battle prowess. When Duke Deathcrier heard the various conversations going on, he sighed inwardly. At the moment, he didn't have much hope at all, and still couldn't figure out what the giant ghost king was thinking. Considering how important the matter was, if Duke Deathcrier had been in charge, he definitely wouldn't have sent Bai Hao in alone. He would have sent in as many people as possible, and would have called on every clan connected to the giant ghost king to try to secure the greatest chance of victory. Even he had to admit that Bai Hao on his own would be unable to come out on top. Duke Deathcrier knew Bai Hao better than anyone else here, and was aware of how brave and fierce he could be, but the matter of fleeing from 3 devas was very different than what would be going on in the necromancer kettle. I just have to trust in His Highness the King, Duke Deathcrier thought, taking a deep breath. Then he thought of how everything had played out with the rebellion of the 3 devas, and all of the things the giant ghost king had done, and it left him with a bit of anticipation regarding how everything would turn out. Even as everyone discussed the matter, the necromancer kettle suddenly began to vibrate, and then rumbling sounds echoed out from inside of it. Mist began to pour out from the mouth of the kettle, drawing the attention of everyone in the area. The old man from 9 Serenities City, the old woman from Spirit Advent City, and the middle-aged man from Arch-Emperor City all turned their flickering gazes to the exit. Who's going to come out first? That was what everyone was thinking. As for Duke Deathcrier, he shook his head, convinced that Bai Hao wouldn't even be coming out. However, he still looked over at the exit. As everyone watched intently, a bedraggled figure appeared, flying at top speed out of the necromancer kettle. It's him. How could he be the first person to come out? Bai Hao didn't die in there? Everyone was stunned, even Duke Deathcrier, whose eyes shone with disbelief. Bai Xiaochun's hair was a mess, and his clothing was ripped and torn. His aura seemed weak, and an unsightly expression could be seen on his face. He was frowning, and clearly irritated. To everyone present, it was very obvious that he was in a foul mood that bordered on madness. Outrageous. Ridiculous, he shouted angrily. As soon as he was out in the open, he headed at top speed toward Duke Deathcrier. Let's go, he said, sounding wronged. He seemed discouraged and downhearted, as though all of his hopes and dreams had been turned into dust. In fact, he didn't even wait for a response from Duke Deathcrier. He simply flew away angrily. Of course, inside he was bursting with nervousness. At the same time, the feeling of pulling a fast one on members of the older generation was very exciting. However, if anyone caught on to the act and looked closely at him, they would surely devolve into madness. Still surprised, Duke Deathcrier sighed, contemplating what must have gone on inside of the necromancer kettle. Clearly, Bai Hao had been bullied to no end, and thus, it was with the shake of a head that he turned and left along with him. As they left, many in the crowd began to chuckle derisively. Now I know why Bai Hao was the first to come out. He definitely got bullied inside, and didn't dare to fight anyone. All he could do was wait until the mouth of the necromancer kettle opened to make his escape. Although, you have to admit that Bai Hao certainly has some extraordinary qualities. The fact that he didn't get killed is amazing. However, the lesson he learned inside will probably force him to keep his head bowed forever. It must have been a bitter lesson indeed. I'd say the only reason he made it out alive was that the heirs apparent didn't want to provoke the giant ghost king too deeply. However, I'm sure they taught some harsh and probably even humiliating lessons to this Bai Hao. Well, they'll all be coming out in a moment, and we can hear the whole story. As they waited, the various Dao protectors continued to joke and chat. Actually, it was happening this way, not because of the flawless performance Bai Xiaochun had just put on, but because an error in their thinking. None of them could possibly imagine how a single person could take on more than 100. Those odds were just too high. Not even the Dao protectors from Nine Serenities City, Spirit Advent City, and Archemperor City spared much thought for Bai Hao. And so they continued to wait, calmly watching the exit and waiting for people to come out. Before long, enough time had passed for an incense stick to burn, but they still weren't worried. After all, it was only to be expected that the fierce fighting inside would take some time to end. Meanwhile, Bai Xiaochun was speeding away from the area as quickly as possible. Duke Deathcrier was next to him. He looked over, and was about to say something, when Bai Xiaochun urgently said, "Deathcrier, old pal, bring out the giant ghost battleship." The way that his voice seemed to tremble with nervousness left Duke Deathcrier feeling very taken aback. "What's going on?" he replied, quickly pulling out the battleship. Bai Xiaochun leapt onto the deck and then urgently said, "Run." Duke Deathcrier's eyes went wide, and all of a sudden, his heart started pounding. He suddenly thought back to all the disastrous things that had occurred in Giant Ghost City, and a chill ran down his spine. However, a moment later, his expression brightened, and then, without the slightest hesitation, he drew upon the power of his cultivation base to send the giant ghost battleship zooming off into the distance. Along the way, Duke Deathcrier was inclined on a few occasions to simply ask about the situation. However, the ill premonition in his heart that continued to grow stronger prevented him from doing so. Bai Xiaochun stood next to him, face pale, anxious and doubtful as he continuously looked over their shoulders. Apparently worried that they were going too slowly, he gave constant reminders to pick up speed. Everything that was going on got Duke Deathcrier's heart pounding harder and harder. Just what did this guy do? He thought, pouring all of the power he could into the giant ghost battleship to keep it moving as quickly as possible. After a long moment passed, he finally couldn't hold it in any longer. "What did you do?" he asked. Bai Xiaochun cleared his throat. Although he was already starting to regret his actions, he was still very proud of what he had accomplished. Sounding very casual, he said, "Oh, nothing. I just kidnapped everybody else, and have them here in my bag of holding." "What? Everybody? You kidnapped them?" Despite being a diva, Duke Deathcrier's mind began to spin as though it had been struck with a sledgehammer. Face filled with a look of incredulity, he looked, first at Bai Xiaochun, and then at his bag of holding. Then his cheek twitched. You. He actually couldn't say anything other than that. However, he knew that the ramifications of what had been done were almost too monumental to calculate. Without even thinking about it, he drew upon 120% of his cultivation base to send the giant ghost battleship shooting at top speed through the air. Rumbling sounds echoed out as they proceeded along toward their destination. As Duke Deathcrier and Bai Xiaochun got closer and closer to Giant Ghost City, the Dao protectors back at the necromancer kettle were starting to get a bit impatient. That was especially true of the old man from Nine Serenities City, who had a distinct glint in his eyes as he looked at the necromancer kettle. Despite being a diva cultivator, the bizarre nature of the necromancer kettle made it impossible for him to see what was happening inside. Next to him was the old woman who had come with Xu Shan. She was also starting to get more and more nervous, and occasionally turned to look in the direction Bai Xiaochun had fled in. More than half the time has passed. Soon the exit will close. Something seems off. Even if they continued fighting after the exit opened, an entire hour has passed. After another hour, the exit will close, and then it will be very difficult for them to come out. Did something unexpected occur inside? No, there's no way. It wasn't just the devas who were starting to get suspicious. The other Dao protectors were starting to feel uneasy. All eyes were focused on the necromancer kettle as more time ticked by. Anxiety mounted. After all, the chosen who were inside the kettle were all very important people. They were all sons and daughters of influential clans and families. Not only were they important in terms of status, their latent talent and cultivation bases were all beyond ordinary. There were even some whose names were on the Hell Emperor stele. These were the best of the best in their generation in the wildlands, all of whom were destined to be powerful people in the future. There were some who were already certain to become devas, and it was even very likely that some would become demigods. If an accident occurred with even one of those people, it would be major news in the wildlands. If something unexpected happened to more than 10 of them, it would be 10 times more shocking of an event. Not even the 3 heavenly kings would be willing to accept responsibility if something like that happened. An accident of that nature would be a blow to the soft spot that existed in all parties involved. Now that everyone was thinking along these lines, their unease grew more intense. Furthermore, because the second prince and Chen Manyao were also still inside, the middle-aged man from Arch-Emperor City was also starting to look very nervous. Eventually, the Dao protectors got so nervous that they began to cry out in anxious voices. Time is almost up. We can't wait any longer. The old man from Nine Serenities City looked over at the Dao protector from Arch-Emperor City. Eyes flashing, he said, "Brother Lin, something happened in here." "That's right, Brother Lin," the old woman from Spirit Advent City said, her voice grating and eerie. "It's a critical situation. The necromancer kettle belongs to the Imperial clan. The Grand Heaven Master must have a way to see inside of it." Before long, almost all eyes had come to rest on that middle-aged man. It was quite a bit of pressure for him to deal with. Furthermore, he knew what those gazes represented, nearly 80% of the most important groups in the entire wildlands. This collection of cultivators was backed by many devas and 3 demigods. I'll need to contact the Grand Heaven Master and let him make the decision. He quickly produced a jade slip and sent an urgent message. Moments later, the jade slip glowed with dazzling light, after which he crushed it. As the jade slip fell apart, it became flying ash that spread out in all directions, then rose up above them and created a fist-sized vortex. Blue light shone out from the vortex, which shot toward the middle-aged man. When he reached out and grabbed it, it turned into a fist-sized blue mirror. The mirror was clearly from ancient times, and was covered with countless faintly glimmering magical symbols. Despite how old it seemed, it still radiated a heaven-shaking, earth-shattering aura. The Grand Heaven Master used a secret magic to deliver this mirror to me. I can't use it on my own. Taking a deep breath, he looked at the old man from Nine Serenities City and the old woman from Spirit Advent City. "Would the 2 of you mind providing some assistance?" They didn't hesitate to fly over and unleash the power of their cultivation bases, sending diva auras out that caused heaven and earth to flash with colors. As their power entered the mirror, it shone with dazzling light that caused the other Dao protectors in the area to back up nervously. The 3 cultivators powering the mirror let out hoarse shouts as the blue light transformed into a column that shot directly toward the necromancer kettle. The air distorted around the blue column of light, which could pass through all restrictive spells and all manner of defenses. Ripples spread out on the surface of the necromancer kettle as it slowly became transparent. Before long, everyone could see everything inside as clear as day. And then, faces began to fall. "There's nobody there, everyone's gone. How is this possible? There were more than 100 of them. Where did they go?" Shouts of alarm could be heard in all directions. The old man from Nine Serenities City and the old woman from Spirit Advent City were so shocked that their cultivation base fluctuations reflected their astonishment. Worried that they were seeing things, they sent more power into the mirror, sending its light sweeping back and forth through the lands inside the necromancer kettle. Under the power of that light, even the densest of mists were dispersed. And yet, they still couldn't find a trace of a single one of the chosen. The middle-aged man from Arch-Emperor City was shaking, and his mind spun with disbelief. "Wait," someone said, "I can detect the aura of the giant ghost king." As everyone began to reach the same conclusion, their eyes turned completely bloodshot, and their hearts began to burn with rage. Everybody went missing, and Bai Hao was the only one to come out. This is definitely the handiwork of the giant ghost king. That Bai Hao is a mere nascent soul cultivator. How could he possibly dare to do something like this? It was definitely the giant ghost king's doing. Remember how Bai Hao looked when he came out? That must have been an act. Damn it. Shouts of rage began to ring out. As for the old man from Nine Serenities City and the old woman from Spirit Advent City, both of them resorted to teleportations to rush in the direction Bai Xiaochun had left in. Enraged, everyone else began to follow. These people were no fools, and they all came to the conclusion that the chosen of their various organizations had been kidnapped by Bai Hao at the behest of the giant ghost king. Even more humiliating was the shocking fact that he had escaped from under their very noses. However, they didn't dare to offend the giant ghost king, so they had no choice but to vent their anger on Bai Xiaochun. Rumbling sounds could be heard, and dazzling light flashed in the sky as more than 100 powerful experts shot through the air in pursuit. Unfortunately for them, they had delayed for far too long. Bai Xiaochun and Duke Deathcrier were on the giant ghost battleship, which Duke Deathcrier was fueling with all the power he could muster. It was a bright beam of light, shooting through the air, closing in on Giant Ghost City. When Bai Xiaochun finally caught sight of the city off in the distance, he breathed a sigh of relief. He even started to get a bit excited. Giant Ghost King, you fudge-licking prick. I'm back. As Bai Xiaochun and Duke Deathcrier were still closing in on the city, the Giant Ghost King was in his royal palace, a very excited expression on his face as he looked at the Ghost King fruit which he held in his hand. The way that he had acquired the fruit by means of the restrictive spell was a violation of certain rules, and yet, the fruit was simply too important to him. How could he possibly allow it to be acquired by others and then used to threaten him? He had really had no other choice than to grit his teeth and proceed with his plan. I finally have all 5 of the Ghost King fruits, and at long last I can remove the 5 elements flaw from my technique. By being able to switch back and forth between the 5 elements at will, I will no longer be subjected to the potentially deadly decay period. With that, he threw his head back and laughed uproariously, his heart filled with intense levels of joy. After years and years of waiting, he had won out, despite being opposed by the united front of all his opponents. The fact that all of his plans and schemes had worked left him feeling very pleased. The 9 Serenities King, War Champion King and Spirit Advent King were all scheming against me, the bastards. I might have broken the rules, but it was only after their plotting. Now I just need to lay low for a while and not give them any reason to cause me any problems. After some time passes, all of the issues can be resolved. A faint smile could be seen on his face, and a bright gleam passed through his eyes. It was wonderful to have all matters under his control. Of course, he had no idea what exactly had occurred in the necromancer kettle. The restrictive spell on Bai Xiaochun didn't give him the ability to see what was happening from afar. It was specifically designed to be used the way it had with the Ghost King orchid. But he wasn't worried. Chuckling, he put the Ghost King fruit away and prepared to go into secluded meditation to merge all 5 of the fruits into his body. Just when he was rising to his feet, his expression flickered, and he looked off into the sky. He immediately caught sight of the giant ghost battleship. As soon as it got close enough, 2 figures leapt off of its deck and flew toward his royal palace. Mixed emotions could be seen playing out on Duke Deathcrier's face, and as for Bai Xiaochun, he seemed both grim and angry. Bai Hao sure got back quickly, the giant ghost king thought. And he doesn't seem injured at all. He cleared his throat awkwardly. He knew that he was in the wrong in the matter that had just occurred, and felt like simply avoiding Bai Hao. However, avoiding him wouldn't resolve the situation, so therefore, he put a somber expression onto his face and then settled back down into his throne to wait. Bai Xiaochun shot at top speed toward the giant ghost statue, followed by a hesitant Duke Deathcrier. After reaching the royal palace, Duke Deathcrier clasped hands to Bai Xiaochun, then hurried back to his own residence, not interested at all in participating in the irksome events which were sure to follow. This Bai Hao has got some guts, but I simply can't believe that he would do something like this unless he was acting on the orders of His Highness the King. Just what is His Highness thinking? Is he really going to go up against all of the nobility and aristocracy in the wildlands? Duke Deathcrier sighed, truly unable to wrap his mind around what was going on. As Duke Deathcrier left, Bai Xiaochun hurried onward to the main entrance. At the moment, he was still very angry. After all, were it not for the fact that he was so incredible, his trip to the necromancer kettle would have been one of almost certain death. And the reason for that was because the giant ghost king had screwed him over. Gritting his teeth, he took a deep breath and buried his anger inside him, then snorted coldly in his heart and walked into the palace's main hall. Trying to look very maligned, he loudly said, Bai Hao offers greetings, Your Highness. As soon as he saw Bai Xiaochun, the giant ghost king rose from his throne and said, Ah, you're back, Hauer. Ha ha ha, you really performed a meritorious service this time. He no longer looked somber like before, and even wore a kind smile. He did nothing to hide the praise in his eyes, and seemed like he truly was delighted to see Bai Xiaochun. It was also his first time ever addressing him as Hauer. A strange expression could be seen on Bai Xiaochun's face, and he was just about to say something when the giant ghost king waved his hand dismissively. Stepping down off of the throne dais, it was with caring emotion that he said, Not hurt at all, I see. You really did a huge favor for me this time. Son, I've already issued orders to throw a spirit banquet for the both of us. Now, tell me what it is you want. As long as it's in my power, I'll grant you any favor. That only made Bai Xiaochun angrier though. Raising his voice, he said, I don't want any gifts. Those people really bullied me, you hear? You have no idea, Your Highness. They all ganged up on me, and were clearly trying to kill me. I had no choice but to do something to protect myself. I may have offended some important people, but it was all in your service, Your Highness. Obviously, the giant ghost king knew that in a situation in which more than 100 people were chasing Bai Hao, it would be difficult for him to survive without injuring or even killing a few people. And yet, the giant ghost king was confident in being able to resolve any issues that had cropped up. Don't worry about it. Everything you did was for me. Fear not, I won't let anything bad happen to you. The maligned expression remained on Bai Xiaochun's face, but inwardly, he was starting to feel very pleased with himself. Giant Ghost King, oh Giant Ghost King, you screwed me over first, so you can't blame me for screwing you right back. Bai Xiaochun was about to say something more when a buzzing sound could be heard from within the Giant Ghost King's bag of holding. They're coming after you so quickly? The Giant Ghost King's eyes glittered, and a faint smile could be seen on his face as he produced a transmission jade slip from his bag of holding. He had been aware all along that, whatever Bai Xiaochun did in the necromancer kettle, it wouldn't be possible to keep it a secret for very long. Therefore, he had long since prepared for the aftermath. With that, he poured some divine sense into the jade slip to power it up. Sounding very calm and composed, he said, 9 Serenities key. However, before he could even finish speaking, the enraged voice of the 9 Serenities king roared out like a volcano to fill the palace hall. How shameless of you, Giant Ghost King. Assuming that the 9 Serenities king was talking about the matter of the Ghost King fruit, the Giant Ghost King cleared his throat and said, 9 Serenities King, let me expel. Before he could say anything else, the 9 Serenities King responded in a voice that echoed like destructive thunder. It even caused the air around the Giant Ghost King to distort. I couldn't care less about how you got that fruit, Giant Ghost King. We plotted against you, so we have no right to complain about you fighting back. But considering your status, how could you possibly do something to my son Zhou Hong? You listen to me, Giant Ghost King. The enmity between 9 Serenities City and Giant Ghost City is not over. With that, the 9 Serenities King severed the communication. The Giant Ghost King's eyes widened. Thinking back to what Bai Xiaochun had just said, he looked over and said, you fought with Zhou Hong? Is he dead? Looking like the picture of righteous indignation, Bai Xiaochun replied, yeah, I fought with him, that big bully. HMPH. I left him with his poor little life, though. Breathing a sigh of relief, the Giant Ghost King said, as long as he's not dead, then it's fine. At this point, the Giant Ghost King couldn't help but muse that Bai Hao's battle prowess really was incredible. Despite being chased by so many people, he still managed to injure Zhou Hong. Just when he was about to continue speaking, his jade slip once again began to vibrate. This time, it shook even more violently than before, and then, even more angry voices could be heard, many of them sounding like they wished to do battle, although not all. Giant Ghost King, my son has always been stubborn and mischievous. He had this tribulation coming. I'll be there in person shortly to express my gratitude. War Champion King. The Giant Ghost King's pupils constricted. Of all of the other 3 heavenly kings, the one he feared the most was the War Champion King. Therefore, he was a bit confused by this latest message, and even more confused about what was going on. Heart-thumping, he suddenly had a very bad feeling, and looked over again at Bai Xiaochun. You fought with the Junior Champion King? He's not dead either, oh him? Bai Xiaochun flicked his hand as if in disgust. Gritting his teeth, he said, no, he's not dead. That bastard was a really tough cookie, though. A strange expression could be seen on the Giant Ghost King's face, but before he could do anything else, his jade slip vibrated again. This time it was the Spirit Advent King, who seemed even angrier than the 9 Serenities King had been. That mysterious daughter of yours is in Arch-Emperor City, isn't she, Giant Ghost King? Nobody else knows, but I do. Well, I think I know where I'm going next. I need to be more like you old bastard. Bullying people younger and weaker than you. As the voice echoed out in the hall, the Giant Ghost King began to pant. Everything was happening too quickly, catching him completely unawares. Looking over at Bai Xiaochun, he was just about to ask a certain question when Bai Xiaochun took the initiative to say, don't worry, Shu Shan isn't dead. As the Giant Ghost King looked at Bai Xiaochun, his ill premonition grew more intense. And yet, before he could say anything, the jade slip in his hand began to vibrate over and over again. Countless messages poured in, some bitter, some pleading, some angry. The giant ghost king's mind began to spin. Despite being a demigod, the current turn of events had him reeling in shock. Although most of the people who were sending the messages weren't on the same level as him in terms of cultivation base, there were simply too many of them. It seemed like just about all of the nobility and aristocracy in the lands of the Arch-Emperor were reaching out to him. And that wasn't even mentioning the fact that the other 3 heavenly kings were involved, and they were on the same level as him. Even the imperial clan messaged him, saying that the second prince was missing. The giant ghost king was dumbstruck by what was happening. Finally, he looked over at Bai Xiaochun, and weakly asked, What? What exactly did you do in the necromancer kettle? Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.